Good afternoon. My name is Darlene Chapman Holmes, and I am the program director here at National League of Cities. And today we are super excited to celebrate our 100th anniversary. This is our year that we have been working with cities and towns and villages across America. And we have a wonderful partner in Pallet that is here today with their team to discuss and have our webinar on integrating housing stability in your community resiliency plans. So without further ado, I'd love to introduce the CEO of Pallet, Amy King, who is here to moderate and work with us and share her insight and all the work that they are doing at Pallet throughout the country. Thank you so much for joining us, and have a great webinar.
Awesome. Thanks, Darlene. Really appreciate you and the National League of Cities and helping us all get prepared and ready for what's coming. My name is Amy King, and I am the founder and CEO of Pallet. Great to be with you all today. I'm really excited about the conversation we're going to have today. I'm going to talk you through a little bit about what Pallet does and what we think about housing stability and resiliency planning. And then I'm going to introduce you to an awesome guy, and we're going to have a conversation about what this looks like. So I'll get right into it and walk you through who we are. So Pallet is a public benefit corporation. We exist for two reasons. Our primary reason for existence is workforce development. So as many of you know, because of the work that you do in the world and in your cities, workforce opportunities are really important, and we need more construction workers and people in the trades industries to build the permanent housing supply that's really needed to end the housing crisis that we're experiencing today. So Pallet's primary mission is to train and engage folks in those trades opportunities. So more than 70% of our staff are folks that are exiting homelessness and the justice system, people who are looking for living wage work and very interested in the trades industries. We get them situated and stabilized and engaged with the manufacturing and construction trades, pay them living wages, and then move them into apprenticeship programs in plumbing, electrical, HVAC, contractors, laborers, that sort of thing. And so the goal, again, is to build that workforce that we need. So in addition to that, the byproduct of that mission are these cool shelters that we make that can address human displacement at speed and at scale, or with speed and at scale, excuse me. So we're really excited about the work we get to do in your cities and hoping to expand that impact. One of the things that we're really starting to engage with and learn more about is the idea of community resiliency. And what does that mean? So I'm going to prime this a little bit, and then our guest is going to give you some more detail about this because he's much more experienced with this than I am. But when we talk about community resiliency, what we mean is the ability of a community to recover from a disaster or some sort of crisis. So this is both looks like climate events like hurricanes and things like that, but it can also be population surges. It can be large events that are happening in your city or your community that are going to disrupt like the daily life of the folks that are there, geopolitical conflicts, and then workforce challenges and economic challenges. All of those things present different types of crises for communities. And you, as city officials and community organizations, are heavily impacted by these events. And so building resiliency for us means looking at public access to health and social services, promoting health and being prepared, planning ahead. Historically in our country, we do things in a reactive way. And I think there's a big push right now, and we're all for it, to move into more of a proactive planning phase where we're preparing for disasters like these and ready to respond. And housing is a big piece of that. So, and communication is a big piece. One of the things that we're really passionate about here at Pallet, and we want you to start thinking about, is your most vulnerable communities. Oftentimes, in a time of crisis, your vulnerable communities are the ones who get left behind. And they often are living in places that are most impacted by natural disasters, by economic challenges. And so they tend to have the highest level of impact. They're already having challenges and barriers, facing barriers, things like that. So as part of your planning process, we really want to encourage you to push for planning and preparedness for those communities so that they still have access to the services that they need, access to stable housing, so that you can stabilize them as well as the rest of the community that you're serving. So a couple of things we want to really think about in terms of resiliency is planning to address these social determinants of health. And so if you're familiar with the CDC has this model, the social determinants of health, that's the picture on the left that you see there. On the right, you'll see Pallet's version of what we call the reintegration ecosystem. And what we mean by this is We work with folks that have been significantly isolated as a result of their experience of homelessness, their interaction with the justice system, and their personal experience with addiction or any combination of those things, excuse me. So all of those activities and experiences are very isolating. Losing your home in a natural disaster, very isolating, very traumatic. Facing economic challenge or losing your access to housing because of a population surge, all of those things are a crisis event. And so for someone to successfully reintegrate into a community, become part of that community again after that experience of trauma and isolation, they need basically four main things. They need access to housing and shelter. We need to meet their basic needs. So food, water, medical aid, things that are, just basic to life safety. We need to think about social services, obviously. So education opportunities, access to healthcare, mental health, all of those things. And then economic viability is the other piece. So for people to get back into housing, get back into their daily life, they really need to figure out, what am I going to do for work, or how am I going to get subsidized services so that I'm economically viable in the city in which I live. And then around those four things are kind of three basic things that are really important for communities to think about and plan for. And of course, funding is a major one that I know you're all struggling with. Effective policy that addresses the needs of everybody in an equitable way. So vulnerable communities all the way up to, whoever else is living in your community. And then you want to engage in that community development piece, keeping folks engaged with each other, keeping people close to home so that they don't migrate away from the community. These are all important things. So these are things that we want to think about as we think about this resiliency planning. So what can you do to take action? We want you to think about defining the potential for disaster or hardship for your community. And again, this is not just about natural disasters. It's a really relevant conversation today as we prepare for a Cat 5 hurricane to hit Florida. And we're keeping those folks in our thoughts today as we know it's approaching quickly. But this is not just about natural disaster. Communities that are resilient are prepared for whatever comes. And again, that looks like a lot of different things. So map your most vulnerable areas, identify effective and utilize public services, and prop them up to be sustainable in the event of a disaster or a crisis. Make a plan, build your own community framework for access to things like healthcare, social services, shelter, map your sites and strategies, figure out where these things are going to go so that when crisis strikes, you're not scrambling, you're ready to respond. And then educate your community members about what these plans are, create communication plans so that you can communicate with community members in the event that communications go down. This is a really important piece. And then building that social connectedness. This is something that's often put aside or forgotten and is really important. So for community members that are isolated to really reintegrate, and this is not just vulnerable populations, this is everyone, after a trauma experience, building that social connectedness is really important for the sustainability of your community, but also for this plan to work. So keeping families together, keeping them with their pets, this is really important, minimizing migration as much as possible, and generating opportunities for those communities to come together, grieve, move on, address the needs, and then decide what's next for them. So one example that we at Pallet have had the privilege of participating in, this is a small scale example, is a situation that happened here locally in our community in Everett, Washington. There was a apartment building that was contaminated. The residents inside were asked to move out. They had nowhere to go because hotels are full to address tourism needs, but also to address homelessness in the city. And so the mayor's office called us. Within about 48 hours, we were able to set up an entire shelter community for those folks in the parking lot of their apartment building so that we were able to keep them together, keep them working with the social service providers that were already serving them, and keep them close to home. When the contamination was cleaned, they were ready to move back in. So this is a small scale example. We're actively living through the example of Hurricane Helene and Hurricane Milton right now in Florida, North Carolina, Georgia, and Tennessee. So these are large-scale events and small-scale events. So now I'm really, really excited to introduce you guys to an awesome gentleman. His name is Patrick Otellini. Patrick is the National Affordable Housing Director for Swinerton, which is a great general contractor located in multiple cities across the country. But prior to his work at Swinerton, Patrick was the Chief Resilience Officer at the city of San Francisco. So we're going to have a little fireside chat. If you registered with us, you'll see that we did have another panelist. She had to go on to something else today and was unavailable at the last minute. But I think this is great because Patrick and I are both really embedded in the housing space. And so I'm excited to have you today. Patrick, thank you for joining us. And we'll just jump right in if you're ready.
Pleasure to be with you all.
All right. So to start off, I really want to start by talking about like what does it mean to be a chief resilience officer? So for those of us who have never been one or don't really understand what that means, explain to the group what is a chief resilience officer? What were your duties? What were you doing for the city of San Francisco in that role?
Sure. So, yeah, it was really exciting to be named the first chief resilience officer in the world. And I was just reflecting on the fact that that was a decade ago. So 10 years ago, the city and county of San Francisco was already very much engaged in what we would consider resiliency work. I had the privilege of serving as the director of earthquake safety before I became the CRO. So, very much in San Francisco's eyes, our resiliency plans were kind of developed through the lens of seismic safety. I think that's a really interesting context because if we back up 10 years ago, what we kind of really considered on the lens and really the political and social narrative around resilience was really based on two events. It was based on Hurricane Katrina and Hurricane Sandy, both with their lessons learned and stories of both recovery and response that really helped inform our plans. But we knew that San Francisco, our risks are different. We had to really plan locally, and not just around the seismic event. We have sea level rise to consider, plenty of other social problems to deal with, but really that's overarching seismic safety lens was really the direction that Mayor Lee wanted to take our resilience efforts and really kind of continue the work that we were already doing in our earthquake safety program, but not do it in a vacuum. Do it in a way that involved all of the other agencies working on very sort of tangent but very much related tasks and getting the community with us every step of the way.
Hmm. Amazing. Super cool. So when you think about resilience, I mean, what does it mean to you for a community to be resilient?
It's really challenging. I'm going to call it what it is. Resilience is a buzzword, right? It's every decade or so we get a new word, and everyone jumps around to try to see how they want to define it. And I'm not trying to downplay it. It's very important for us to think about integration in terms of our survivability as a people.
Mhm.
I think when we talk about resilience, it's what does that mean for that recovery period after a disaster? And it could be any disruption. We've seen that. I had some friends that were working in emergency management around the start of this century, and they were planning for lots of terrorism attacks. They dealt with the recovery from 9/11, and then watching what happened, they got hit by Sandy. Right. So here they are thinking about a terrorist threat when it was really a climate threat that came and hurt the city. So, you have to be flexible in your responses. You have to be adaptable into kind of understanding the threats that are going to be facing a different jurisdiction.
Yeah. And every city's so different and has different challenges and risks, right? So I know one of the important roles of resilience planning is engaging the community. So can you talk a little bit about in your role as CRO for San Francisco, how did you engage stakeholders? How did you get the community engaged in this conversation around planning?
Yeah, so we are a city that is not shy of members of the public trying to get involved in the process. So it was very easy to engage the public, to be honest. We also I had the benefit of stepping in after the work of some great people that were in front of me, namely Lawrence Cornfield, who was the former chief building inspector for the city and county of San Francisco, and him and several other members of the community began a community outreach process called CAPS, the Community Action Plan for Seismic Safety.
Mm.
And this was really unique. It was really the first time we took something as esoteric and complex as building code requirements and kind of flipped it to the community to get their impact and their reaction to it. And so what we did is we came up with a 30-year plan, kind of looking at all the major threats, everything from building retrofits to community preparedness, everything that we would think about in terms of a responsible reaction and recovery to a seismic event. And so getting those folks together was really important because as we started this kind of groundbreaking legislation around retrofits, around evaluations, we had support from kind of both sides of the table, so to speak. We had, landlord groups and tenant activist groups together at the same table, which was a hard thing to do, but ultimately led to some very good balanced policy. And I'm very proud of my time in the city government there with my team and I. We did 14 pieces of legislation that were
Wow.
all 11-0 votes at the Board of Supervisors. And if you know anything about the blood sport that is San Francisco politics, it's a very unique thing to get that kind of unanimous agreement. So we're very proud about the policy that we push forward because it did really reflect our community. And so I think having support at every level is super hard to do, but it's really important to do that work up front, because previously what most cities do is they pass a big law and then have the community deal with it. Our laws were shaped by our community. I think that was paramount to the success of the program.
Yeah, amazing. That's incredible. And yes, the politics in San Francisco is a blood sport. I have been witness to it. So kudos to you. So on this topic of, climate events, because we're, currently facing a Cat 5 hurricane headed towards the state of Florida, who's already undergone a big significant issue with Helene. In your experience, what kinds of impacts and issues do you expect to see following this event that cities could learn from and be prepared for?
Well, I first want to state a caveat that, I don't know the situation on the ground. And I
Yeah.
think that's incredibly important to state up front,
Yeah.
right? To understand that there are emergency managers that are in various degrees of their planning process. My guess is they've already started to plan and execute their recovery. I think that's one of the things that we've really learned is that it's not about response. We do response pretty well. We have very competent emergency managers. We have very competent first responders in most of our major cities. And so to see that part, I don't want to say it's perfect, right? But it's something we do very well. Where cities fall down is on the recovery piece. And
Yeah.
we've seen metrics in every way, shape, and form that say cities that are actively planning their recovery during the incident are much more successful in their outcomes, especially when you think about the vulnerable and disenfranchised in our communities.
Yeah.
As you appropriately mentioned, these are the folks that get left out of a lot of planning processes, and these are the folks that need the most help. So to be able to kind of plan for your recovery during the response and executing that recovery during the response is hugely important. And that looks a lot different in different cities. We know that there's different institutions. One thing that we've really seen is that people trust the nonprofits they trust daily, right? So if you're in a community and there's a disaster, I'm more inclined to go to the community center around the corner where my son goes tutoring twice a week, as opposed to some brand new pop-up that I'm not really sure how it works. I'm not really sure what I'm going to get there. We saw this happen in every major disaster the United States has faced. These community anchors that were already there just get propped up and strengthened in a great way. So I think that's something that gets ignored a lot. I think a lot of times cities will just say, oh, we're going to come set up this hub and we're going to come take care of everybody. It's not that simple. Not only is it not that simple logistically, it's also hard to staff it. And it's also hard to get the community to buy in, right? What's the worst thing you could do is go set up something with a ton of resources that no one takes advantage of. So
Mhm.
again, another reason to highlight the community involvement, because those residents will tell you the institutions they trust in their neighborhood, and they're not shy about it. And I think that's hugely important for cities to have very open ears when they're listening in that conversation.
Yeah, that's great. I love that. That's such a good insight. And I think, like we talked about, these vulnerable communities are often overlooked in the planning process, or sometimes they're hard to get feedback from. I mean, it's not, I think cities are trying to engage those populations. What, in your experience, is the best way to really apply an equity lens to these issues and planning processes to make sure that vulnerable populations are not left out of the conversation and their voices are heard?
There's a few different thoughts I have when you ask that question, Amy. One of the first and foremost is political leadership. I think we have great folks at the department level that are capable of executing, but if you don't have electeds that are out in front of this and really directing departments to focus their resources appropriately, it sort of gets lost. Now, that said, I don't want to place all of the responsibility on the electeds. They are sort of the mouthpiece that kind of play to the public and actually set the tone for the recovery and response. But
Mhm.
also having that coordination internally is super important, right? To be able to understand the department heads, but then, it doesn't just stop at city government. One of the interesting things that we did when I was with the city is we ran a project called the Lifelines Council. And this was a pet project of Mayor Ed Lee, who has since passed away. We miss him dearly, but he was very passionate about getting our utility providers at the table. So, we have responsibility as a government to a certain extent, right? We regulate life and safety. We're administering the building code along private buildings, but there's a huge component of that the city does not control. And so we would just have these meetings with our utility providers from electrical power, water, all the way down the line to cell service and coverage along those things. And to have them just talking was a really interesting, just way to start the conversation. I'm not pretending that we solved all the problems, but we did know each other. And so having that community of folks that can talk. And one of the things that we did that was especially interesting to me is we ran a tabletop exercise in our EOC. And what we did is we invited all the utility providers. We threw a scenario at them and we watched what happened. You'd be surprised, like you would expect. There was a lot of breakdowns in communication. You kind of had different providers pointing at each other saying, oh, I can't get my system up and running until this. And what you really understand is there's incredible interdependencies that exist in that space. And a good colleague of mine, Laurie Johnson, has done some really amazing work around this. So for those of you who are kind of want to dig deeper in that, she's done some interdependency studies for cities and what recovery timelines look like as a result. So I think those are there's a bunch of different factors and kind of thinking and making sure you're looking at your most vulnerable population. But it's not just, there's a lot of different factors. One of the things that we really focused on, because it was a priority to our earthquake safety program, was retrofitting San Francisco's soft story buildings. This is a program that I'm incredibly proud of. It has the highest compliance rate of any seismic retrofit program in the country's history, and it
Wow.
retrofit the homes of about 120,000 San Franciscans. So
Wow.
that's more than 10% of our population that previously lived in buildings that we knew were collapse prone and now have been retrofit, which preserves not only rent controlled, affordable, naturally occurring affordable housing, but just people that don't have the ability to make those decisions because they don't own the property. So you can imagine doing a very sensitive piece of legislation with required retrofits took a very delicate process, really involving all the stakeholders. But ultimately, when we're talking about the vulnerable, it's the folks that are the renters in that building whose hands are tied in terms of the seismic performance of it. So when we can identify these buildings as dangers, we have to come up with responsible ways to support those landlords to make those fixes. So it's definitely a two-way street, and a really important balance is needed there.
Yeah, that's great. I love that. I mean, kudos to you for that great work. And I think from our perspective too, one other strategy that I would be remiss not to mention is to hire people with lived experience who are from the vulnerable populations into your planning groups and into your roles, right? I mean, that's something that we're really passionate about, is hiring folks with lived experience. And I think a lot of cities will engage vulnerable populations in a way that can sometimes feel tokenizing to them. So hiring them and paying them to be part of the process is a really great way to get really good, solid feedback that is useful for planning. And so think about that too when you're thinking about your processes. So I want to transition a little bit. You mentioned housing, which is a really important part of this process of resiliency planning. And I think we all know housing is a really hard thing for people to think about. And it's a crisis. We're at a crisis point. There's not enough of it. We can't build it fast enough. We all know that. And then a disaster strikes, whether it be naturally occurring or whatever, and you lose that housing. So I want to talk a little bit about your role currently at Swinerton and what you're doing there. But I also want to talk about this from the perspective of the private sector. So you've gone from public sector to private sector. Let's start with, what role can the private sector play in maintaining housing supply and engaging in this resiliency conversation?
It's a great question. And I think, your comments about lived experience, that's an important point there, Amy. I think that's that shouldn't go just glossed over there. I think it's so important in the work that you guys do at Pallet. And part of the reason why I've been so impressed with your organization is kind of how you let your design be informed by the people who work for you that are actually have that lived experience. I mean, I think that's very powerful, and it's not that dissimilar to how you would see the private sector getting engaged in this space, right? We build housing at all levels, and lately, basically since the pandemic, we've been very engaged in interim transitional communities, and so I think that level of work is so important because we're seeing such an impact. Unfortunately, affordable housing, permanent housing, I think we all agree is the solution, but it takes a long time to build. Most of the affordable housing that I'm building right now currently, spent 5 or 6 years in entitlements, another 2 years getting the capital stack together. So very realistically, we're looking at a decade from sort of conception to people to heads and beds, right? And so
Yep.
I think that's a big important thing to think about. It is important. We need to push towards permanent, but we also know there are people dying on the streets right now.
That's
So
right.
what do we do? Swinerton is an employee-owned company. So, while we are very much a private sector organization, we are owned by the women and men in our company. So I think that gives us a little bit bigger of a social consciousness. And so
Mhm.
we've been very engaged in this since the beginning and since we first kind of had the opportunity to get in the mix here. And so I think that's something that speaks to it. But at the end of the day, I'm not going to sugarcoat it. Private sector is private sector. They need to figure out a way to pay their people and to be able to get engaged in this work that meets their business goals. And so
Yep.
when we approach this, we certainly don't look at these projects as a moneymaker, right? But we do know, hey, we're going to have prevailing wage or union wage requirements depending on where we are. We need to make sure we pay our people, and we need to make sure we cover the risk that we take on as a general contractor, right?
Yeah.
So I would say we definitely go into these projects with a social mind, but also knowing that we are the owners of our company and we are putting our company at risk literally with every construction project, right? That's the nature of our business. So I
Yeah.
think that manage risk in a responsible way is kind of how we look at it. But I think other companies, other peers in the space, definitely speak a lot about social responsibility, but I don't see them putting their money where their mouth is as much as I'd like to see. That's my own
Yeah.
personal gripe, right? But
Yeah.
plenty of companies out there doing great things. Don't get me wrong,
Yeah.
but I think at the end of the day, engaging the private sector is tricky because there's sort of a perverse motivation there, right? You have to make money. You're in business for a reason. So I think that looks a little different. And what I get scared about, especially in the wake of disaster, is sort of this kind of post-disaster feeding frenzy that can happen. We call it kind of disaster opportunistic capital, or however you want to describe it. But I think that's what I get concerned about, because there's such a storm that happens, and there's so much noise that happens after an event, and making sure that you have credible actors at the table is super important. So I think cities, to the extent they can, it's a hard thing to do, but to pre-qualify people, to sort of get a list of people together, whether that's folks like Pallet that are providing the shelters, whether it's folks like Swinerton that's doing the labor. I mean, there's a whole host of folks you need at the table to help you after a disaster. Unfortunately, cities don't usually like to think about that until it's too late. So that's something that, can be done to sort of engage the private sector early on. But also, as public officials, put it in a context that makes sense for them, right?
Yeah.
They're not going to come to the table because you ask. They're going to come to the table because they're going to see some value and some for them as an organization to be there, whether it's perverse or not. And I think that's really important for the mindset of the city. Just shaming someone and asking them to come to the table doesn't garner good results. You need to put this in context where they understand it.
Yeah, yeah, meet their bottom line too, which I think that's so great, Patrick. And I'm glad you mentioned it, because you're right. And in this moment, it's so relevant. There is a disaster response feeding frenzy going on, right? That's what happens. But it happens with homelessness too. And I think it's an issue that cities are very aware of, but they don't know how to give voice to it sometimes. And I think, there's this kind of dirty word of the homeless industrial complex, which is very real. It's a very real thing. There are people who are profiting and benefiting off of homelessness. And the reality is, as you said, for-profit entities and private sector entities have to be able to pay their people. That's part of how we drive the economy. But finding out who you're working with and making sure that they're moving to actually rehabilitate people in a sustainable way, that's the key, right? I think there's a lot of folks who have unintentionally fallen victim to, well, if we rehabilitate people, then we don't have customers anymore, right? Well, that's not helping anyone. And if we're never going to get out of this crisis, if we don't work to sustainably move people out of these situations by giving them living wage jobs and giving them opportunities and bringing them to the table, and then now we're moving people into a place where they are sustainably exiting these systems, and then you cut off the customer base to that industrial complex, right? And really, planning is a key part of that, because if you're prepared, you're not paying as much of a premium on the back end, right? So I think it's a really important conversation that is rising to the surface right now for a lot of folks, and it's a hard one to have, but it's important. I mean, there's a lot of bad players out there. So
especially when you think about the goal in our communities is to get to a functional zero on homelessness, right? And we know how to do it. This is not a secret. We know how to do it. It's just getting the jurisdictions to really put forth that effort and to spend that political capital they need to actually get serious about it, because there's a lot of front loading that we need to do, but also, to your point, there's a lot of services that are needed after the fact. And if we are kind of propping up both sides of that between the shelter continuum, I think we're really starting to see better results that ultimately keep us at a functional zero and get us to kind of avoid that pitfall and problem. But the problem is we're kind of sort of undoing a lot of the damage that's already been done. So it's hard to get that back up to a level playing ground and then kind of execute what the future would look like.
Yeah, absolutely. Totally agree. And I think the challenge, and I'm glad to hear this transition that's happening in the communities. For so long, we focused on housing first, which is a very good methodology at its core. But over time, it's become housing only. And now you hear HUD and other groups talking about it's not housing only, it's housing and services. And that's right. And we know from people with lived experience, not just in homelessness, but also in disaster response, just replacing someone's home is not always enough. People have had very significant trauma experiences. They've had resulting mental health challenges and things. Those things have got to be addressed. And if they're not addressed, just four walls and a roof is not going to solve the problem, right? It's a really important part of the conversation.
Yeah, I think what's interesting there is there's a nuanced conversation around housing, right? What do we consider housing to be? The building code is very clear on its minimum habitability standards on what they think housing should be, and I think that's appropriate, right? It's appropriate when we look at, okay, for permanent housing, these are the requirements that you should meet. And that's always been a challenge with interim transitional housing is how do you build housing that's emergent, it's needed in an emergency that you need fast. You acknowledge it's not going to be permanent housing, but how do you do it in a way that still creates a dignified situation for people? And that's an interesting policy conversation, because I
Yeah.
think it's very lofty for us to have these minimum standards while people are dying on the streets. That's
Yeah.
not right. And I
Yeah.
think folks like yourself are right in the middle of that more than I am, Amy. But I think that's such an interesting conversation to have around what does this mean to house our people, and what does it mean to build housing. And I do this work across the country, and it's really fascinating to have these conversations in different cities, whether I'm in Atlanta, whether I'm in Austin, whether I'm in Denver. It feels like Groundhog's Day in the same way, where we're having the same conversation. It's just like a different verse in the same song, right? With their community approach to they're all going to be different. But we are seeing this sea change where before the NIMBYism is, I don't want to say it's gone away. That would be foolish for me to say it's gone away. But I have seen these conversations around housing in our community at all levels, and people embracing it differently. People
Yeah.
knowing that, all right, whether they have a personal connection to it, they have someone who has that lived experience, or they're just kind of waking up in a social mindset a little bit more than we have previously. Times are hard.
Yeah.
And having, you said it earlier in terms about the other outcomes that are kind of needed to look at, but at the end of the day, there's no better medicine than housing, right?
Yeah.
If we get a roof over someone's head, all of the outcomes are hedged in their favor. Doesn't mean it fixes them, but I think it's the biggest first step you can have. And that makes me question why we have minimum habitable standards, right? I totally get it from a
Yeah.
code standpoint, but I think it's pushing that conversation on how do we actually find scalable and equitable solutions in our communities.
Yeah. Well, that's so great, Patrick. I appreciate so much your perspective as a building code professional and someone who understands the code. The code exists for a reason, for health and safety, right? And it's very important. But we have to acknowledge the fact that the health and safety of allowing people to be outside and without cover, whether it's because they've lost their house to a storm or because of a personal crisis, that doesn't meet basic habitability standards either. And we should not be okay with people being on the streets and say, well, there's nothing else that we can do when we do have resources and available opportunities that maybe don't meet your permanent housing code standards, but get really close. Or if you plan well and you think about it as a true interim solution, I think that's the other piece that I want to make sure we highlight is it's really important as you think about interim and transitional housing and shelter, regardless of whether it's personal or climate crisis or whatever, that there's a plan for throughput, right? We don't want people to move into communities like Pallets or others like us, or even like safe sleep sites with RVs and tents, right? It can be a great resource for some communities and what they can do at the time. And that's better than just allowing people to kind of flounder outside without any resources. And as you mentioned, getting someone inside is the start to the clarity to engage with services, right? People cannot move out of survival mode when they don't have basic housing. So housing first as a core methodology is the right way, but then the services have to come with it. But when we think about these models, the planning process has to include that throughput. Who are your community partners that are allowing you and working with you to find permanent placement for folks, to subsidize the risk of renting to someone who's a non-traditional renter? How do we get that conversation going around shifting landlord engagement? I mean, these are big, tough topics, right? But these are things that cities are really struggling with. And I know a lot of cities I talk to, they want to do interim housing and shelter models, but they're like, well, what are we going to do for throughput? So what would be your response to that? How does a city think about the full continuum of housing in a really thoughtful way?
So the full continuum is a challenge. You're absolutely right. Because these players and these partners in the community change over time, right? Who may be the star player in the community this week may be different 5 years from now, right?
Yeah.
And so I think their cities have to acknowledge that, and they have to create sort of moments in their planning processes to ponder that and involve the people who may be the emerging service providers. I'm sort of using that as an example, but those players, whether utility companies, anybody who has a responsibility in this, needs to be at the table.
Mm-hmm.
For jurisdictions, we built a lot of these communities over the last couple of years, and one of the things that we've learned is when cities are at the table and actively engaged, first of all, that makes a big difference. It sounds like kind of a bonehead thing to mention, but when you have a public works director or a building official who are moving mountains to make sure this happens and to make sure you get your inspections, get your sign offs, so you can open these communities, that's everything. The other big factor that we've seen in terms of reducing costs is leaning on emergency building codes. Most jurisdictions still consider this housing crisis an active emergency. So it's activated all of their emergency appendices within the code that allow them to do things which can kind of help you offset some of these costs. I'll give you a couple of real examples too. So we found that if a community is sort of required to sort of, I don't want to say permanent because that's sort of a loaded term here, but let's just say has most of the bells and whistles that the building code requires. Things like underground and cast iron sewer pipes, when this could really be used by a hose or something that's a temporary conveyance system. So that way it's going right into the catch basin. There's other things like sprinkler requirements. Many of the communities that we're doing right now have a full-time 24/7 services. So that effectively is a fire watch, right? You still have to be concerned about fire safety. Don't let me downplay sprinklers. They're very important, but they're expensive, right? And so there's so many things that we can layer on. And just those two things I mentioned can add, $100,000 per door at one of these communities. We found that about 50% of our construction cost is left in the ground after we demobilize the community because of all the infrastructure requirements. So I think cities that can be smart and flexible on how to, maintain a safe community, but relax some of these code requirements, because at the end of the day, you can't be spending $1 million a unit for interim transitional housing, right? And it can very easily get that way if cities don't really think creatively about the solution.
Yeah, I'm so glad you mentioned that. Infrastructure is such a pivotal piece of a dignified experience, water, sewer, power, those things. But those things are so expensive. And so we've been talking with cities about creative ways to do overhead temp strikes. And when you're in the construction world, the construction world works with temporary infrastructure all the time. But then if we're moving towards permanency, people want to trench and bury things and add conduit and all of that makes sense, but it gets really expensive. And then with our electrification of the world, which is good for the climate, electricity is getting harder to get. All of the stuff that you need, all the transformers, those are getting harder to get. They're getting more expensive. And so can you talk a little bit about infrastructure creativity? And you mentioned a few things that I loved, but like how do you guys at Swinerton think about infrastructure, or even in your role as CRO, thinking about infrastructure after a crisis and it's gone, right? There is nothing available. How can these cities think about infrastructure in a different way?
Yeah, so I'll kind of address that in two different ways. Thinking about post-disaster response is super important for utility companies, and really understanding what that process looks like for them. Cities unfortunately don't engage that much on that process. I think most cities sort of have a typical setup where they would deploy, whether these are folks from public works, folks from building department, deploy their people as emergency service workers to sort of do a sidewalk survey, go check out the city, understand where the big problems are, and then start to come up with a plan. That is such an inefficient way to do that. And unfortunately, it's just sort of the standard. And so I think, making sure that there's constant communication with those utility providers. And then also that, you have things set up in a major disaster. We may have large parts of San Francisco cordoned off because there may be tilting buildings that are collapse hazards. Right. And you may see, you saw this, in New Zealand after the earthquakes, more than a decade ago. Their CBD basically did not recover because there were so many questionable buildings that they just walled off. And so, how are you going to get utility providers in there to do restoration when there's a real threat to health and safety for a potential collapsed building? Those kind of examples can play out in any disaster, not just a seismic event. So I think that's a really, really tricky piece to it.
Yeah.
In terms of what we're seeing sort of on the interim transitional housing side, like you mentioned electrical, right? So, for any of our projects right now, anybody who's in the construction space knows it takes you almost a year to get switchgear right now.
Yep.
So if I'm trying to build an interim transitional community in 3 months, how am I going to energize this
Yeah.
thing? So, I mean, so when we look, we have a set of best practices that we go over with jurisdictions and with nonprofits when we look at a site, right? Site selection is so important. And unfortunately, jurisdictions are not thinking like construction people, right? They're going to say, hey, we have this site, you guys can use it, go for it. That site may not be ready for flooding. That site may not have any utilities to it. It may be a dirt lot. So we do know that there's a couple of, we'll just call them like 8 different things that you kind of look at. And if you're checking all those boxes, your approach and your speed to mobilizing is going to be exponentially faster. If you have some sort of temp power, if there's an existing, like we built the first tiny home community with over 70 cabins in San Francisco more than 2 years ago. there's an existing building there that allowed us to be able to tap off of that as temp power. That's the
Yep.
only way we were able to get that energized in time. And so that's something where, you're really starting to see pressures. Utility hookups, things like that, especially if they're within the city's jurisdiction or if they oversee that in the local jurisdiction, that can be accelerated. You can have some political capital, but if it's a private utility and a private utility that's already impacted, like we have here in California, you start to see some really scary timelines. And
Yeah.
then, are there solutions to that? Absolutely. As you said, in the construction business, we're used to them, right? So, okay, yeah, sure, I could throw up a generator. I could throw some. Guess what? That stuff's not free, right? And
Yep.
so I think a lot of the things that are happening right now is we see a very big range where we built these communities where they were around $30,000 a door for the kind of the most simple setup. But then we've also seen ones that are pushing over $300,000 a door because of the requirements that get put on top of that. So I think there's such a big range. And to your point earlier, cities that are doing this for the first time, they're not nuanced at it, right? So they're sort of faking it till they make it, and they're
Yeah.
trying to get through, and they're well intentioned, right? But if
Yep.
you run this like do a normal public works procurement, you're going to be specking pillows that cost $100. You're going to be spending $1 million on rigid conduit. I mean, these things
Yeah.
that we have in the code that are kind of no brainers. But in a situation like this, we need to apply a lens of frugality and a lens of what does this actually mean in terms of its safety requirement. And if it can be relaxed and still maintained in a safe condition, those are the areas that we need to focus on to reduce these costs.
Yeah, that's so great. I'm so glad you mentioned that because I think there are a lot of cities that are struggling with, we want to do this, but we don't know how. And as you very wisely mentioned, city staff and officials are not real estate developers. They're not contractors, nor should they be. I mean, sometimes you get that crossover of experience, but I think it's an interesting sort of situation that we've created in the US now where we expect the government to engage and address these things, but these are folks who have not learned or studied or practiced or understand what this takes. And so it takes longer, it takes more resources because they're learning as they go. And so I think that's a challenge I know a lot of cities that we talk to are struggling with. And I think, while we're in this moment, I want to offer to those cities like, Patrick, Swinerton, and Pallet have done this many, many times. If we can help you, please reach out. We want to help cities be successful at addressing their crises without overthinking things, right? And this is where the private sector does become a really important member of the table of the conversation, right? And a seat holder because the private sector does know these things. This is what they do every single day. And so bringing them to the table to help you think about how to do this in a faster, more cost-efficient way so you can conserve more resources for the permanent housing supply that you do need to build. And you have your runway to that, but you have your cash for it, right? So I want to ask you one final question, but before I do, I'm going to quickly mention to the audience, don't forget if you have questions for Patrick or I, please put them in the Q&A box. There's already some in there, but please add them in. We're going to switch to questions here in just a minute. But I want to, as a last question for you, Patrick, I think, we've talked a little bit about infrastructure and we know there's lots of money at the federal government, at the state government levels and local governments that goes towards infrastructure. But traditionally, housing is not considered a part of infrastructure. We're talking about roads and bridges and utilities and things like that. How can we rethink that as a society? And do you think that's an important adjustment to make that we consider housing supply a part of basic infrastructure at every level of government?
I mean, I love that question, Amy. What is infrastructure? Infrastructure are the parts and pieces that we all need to survive.
Mhm.
Housing is a big part of that. And you're exactly right. Traditionally, housing hasn't really been talked about as infrastructure. But look at what's happened over the last 5 years. That conversation has changed. We're talking about housing in the presidential debates where housing was sort of a less sexy topic, right? People were
Mhm.
not talking about it at that level of policy. And so I think we're going to start seeing tremendous investments be made along those lines. And they've already been happening, right? Because we understand that our cities are faced with so many pressures. And if people can't afford to live there, that impacts your workforce, it impacts the makeup of your community. And none of those outcomes are good, right? Those are all bad outcomes in that situation. So I think making sure that we have housing that is built to a high standard too. I mean, I think, building substandard housing is the worst thing we can do. We need to think about housing that considers the effects that we see today. I think about Florida and their building code changes to provide strong walls in new buildings, right? That's great. So you're having that level of hurricane protection. But guess what? That doesn't cascade down to the existing buildings.
Yeah.
Same thing with earthquakes on the West Coast, right? You have buildings that now, if they're being built today, are built to, withstand a particular level earthquake, and we all agree that's the standard they should be built at. But the vast majority of our housing stock in San Francisco has built after the 1906 earthquake, so it hasn't really been tested by a seismic event in a century. So, I mean,
Mm.
to think about those things that we still need to figure out. We're pretty good about thinking about new buildings and how those new buildings contribute to resilient infrastructure, but most of the world is built. So we have to think about what's already there. And I don't pretend to have easy solutions to those. We've seen, I gave a couple of examples of how we've done that with some seismic programs, but those seismic programs took a decade to develop and, a tremendous amount of community outreach. We did the work on it. And it still was met with some resistance. So it's not like, it's not like you can go around and turn this around in one day. But I
Yeah.
think that idea that we need people at all income levels to be able to live in our communities because they are important contributors to our community.
Mhm.
I think that's first and foremost. And I have seen that change a lot, even in the city I live in San Francisco. People are much more pro housing. They're much more pro density. I think that's something we also need to talk about is that, density in a responsible way is very important for permanent housing. If you can
Yes.
add another floor or two of units through a density bonus, all of a sudden your cost per door goes down significantly and that job starts to pencil, especially in an environment where we have high interest rates, where we have a high level of uncertainty around a lot of the development community figuring out if they're going to push forward new projects. I think whatever we can do to give that community some certainty going forward. And then, obviously they're going to do their business math to make sure that they can afford to build the project and pencil it. But anything we can do to make projects pencil,
Yeah.
especially in a way that is adding to the fabric of our community and providing more homes for people, that's a win-win. I'm
Yeah.
not going to pretend it's easy, but that's what the work looks like in my mind.
Yeah. Yeah, I totally agree. And it's such a complicated discussion and process. We could probably have a whole another webinar on how to make projects pencil. Like, let's talk about parking requirements. We don't have time today, but like there's so many hot topic issues that, I think for those of us that come from the construction industry and have experience in it, there's a lot of things that you can do and a lot of strategies. It's just a matter of working them into your plans, right? So, okay, well, we want to move to question and answer, make sure we answer some of your questions. There's some really good ones in here, and I'm sure we're not going to get to them all. But there's one in here that is really interesting to me because I'm not overly familiar with this. So I'm going to ask you this and see if you know, Patrick. The person said, would you be able to highlight the value of social impact assessments to enhance community resilience and inform the recovery process for vulnerable communities? What is a social impact assessment? I don't know what that is. Do you have that?
I'm not familiar with that term, but I can surmise what I think they're going to get
Okay.
out there.
Okay.
I think that question overarchingly is aimed at understanding your vulnerable populations before a disaster, and understanding what those needs look like. And I think that's super important work, right? And that work, often if it's led by a jurisdiction, is frankly a little clumsy. It's hard for them to lead it.
Mhm.
So there's a lot of different service provider networks, right? So where the nonprofit service provider is working with other nonprofit service providers or faith-based organizations, however they choose to organize themselves. Those kind of clearinghouses are really important for understanding because I've seen it city after city where they go ahead and make assumptions, and almost always those assumptions are wrong. And so, really understanding, you'll see things when we did this in San Francisco. One of the things I wasn't thinking about was the need for dialysis centers post-disaster, right? It's something that's a little obscure. But guess what? If you need dialysis, you need that facility. That's not
Yeah.
something that's optional for you. And so
Yep.
you think about these other kind of social needs that are sort of along that spectrum, and making sure that that's a couple of thoughts in a plan, but ultimately that's going to trigger something that's getting a response aimed at including more people. So that's a real big thing there is doing that sort of social needs assessment
Yeah.
helps you sort of create the tent that you want to put everybody in your population under to make sure no one's being left out, and no one's going to ever accomplish that 100%. I think that's
Yeah.
work that's it's aspirational. It's never checked the box. So
Yeah.
you're constantly doing that work. If you a city that's doing that well never stops, and it's constantly trying to understand that.
Yeah, that's great. It's not a one and done thing. It's a thing you got to keep working at it every year, reassessing, or even more frequently than that, and knowing who's living in your community and what their needs are, right? Thank you. That was great. I'm glad you had an answer for that because I did not. So another really good question that I love, the person said, are there strategic opportunities where public-private partnerships can be explored to answer the housing supply crisis across North America? And I'll let you answer this, but I'll quickly add yes. And I think it's a common practice to think of private contractors. I think we also need to think about the role of finance when we talk about housing. And there are some private finance partners. There are some new creative financing tools coming online. And I think there's some private-public partnership around corporate sponsorships and philanthropic engagement as well that help to subsidize the creation of affordable housing that's sustainable. So I want to add that piece, but Patrick, would love for you to answer this too.
Sure. And I love the question. I love the topic of P3 involvement because I've seen both sides of it.
Yep.
At Swinerton, we do a lot of P3 developments and we do them well. Whether they're doing public safety buildings or other sort of government related projects, we're doing an affordable housing P3 in the state of Texas right now. So I do see those get done, especially when, I have a lot of faith in our leadership and kind of how that's being set up. But I've also seen it from the city side. In grad school, I wrote a paper about how I didn't think P3s were a good idea, and that was based on my experience in city government. P3s are great for city leaders because they allow you to do something that's sort of outside of what your capitals planning people are going to let you do, right? There's no bond for that. You're basically taking on a big project, whether that's a toll road, a bridge, whatever the P3 situation is. And what I've seen city managers or other responsible folks in jurisdictions act like that kid in college when they send you your first credit card. They just start sending you everything and you're like, oh, now I can go out and buy whatever I want. That's dangerous. I've seen so many P3 jobs go south because the city wasn't protecting its best interest and the contractors involved were predatory in nature. That's a bad combination. And you think about what that environment looks like post-disaster, that's an even worse situation. But I have totally turned a new page just because I have seen good examples working at Swinerton. And we do a lot of P3 through a company called Griffin Swinerton, which is a partnership that we've established particularly for P3 pursuits. And so I think there's a lot of players in that space. And why I think it's particularly pertinent now is that we're seeing tax credit financing for permanent housing get so competitive. Most of my clients that are affordable nonprofit housing developers are spending more than 5 years trying to apply for state tax credits to be able to build their project. So we have to look at different ways of financing. I don't pretend that P3 is the magic bullet that solves all of this, but it certainly is an alternative that makes a lot of sense. It's a good delivery method, and when done right, can provide a lot of co-benefits. Like the best P3 projects are where you're doing, housing, a library, a community center, and a transit station, or we kind of combine all these great things into one project. Then it's powerful, and then it can really move the needle. So I think P3 is a really important tool that hasn't been leveraged as much that it can be now.
Yeah, that's great. I love that. I'm a big fan of P3 projects too. And anything that's mixed use and mixed income really creates that good societal framework for success and social connectedness, right? So I think that's great. This is a really great one. I love this one. Someone asked, in terms of the housing continuum, how has upstream eviction prevention strategies factored into your CRO planning efforts? So when you were CRO, did you have to think about eviction prevention?
I guess I had the fortune of not having to be too involved in it as CRO, but I see it a lot more now. Now I'm much more involved in housing conversations kind of at that pre-eviction level, because what we can spend to help stabilize someone's rent or to help stabilize them in their home that they're already in keeps them from being that person on the street that then all of a sudden we're spending a lot more money. So a little bit of money up front is helping stabilize this. And this kind of gets back to our earlier conversation about sort of fixing the flow that we've created of folks going to street homelessness. Correcting that is super important, and that really comes with financial stability. And so I don't pretend to have strong opinions on what those thresholds should be or what that amount looks like, but the overall intention to be able to help people before they get out on the street. That's how we stop it, right? I think coming up with enough beds, coming up with enough shelter capacity, that's all a piece of the equation for dealing with our street population now, or those folks that are going on the street today. But coming up with systems to be able to keep people there, super important. And so I think that's where we're starting to look now. I think a lot of communities are realizing what they've spent not only combating street homelessness, but what does that mean for their emergency rooms? What does that mean for the impact on the healthcare system? What does it mean for the impact on the jails? These are all
Yeah.
things that shouldn't be a factor. So I
Yeah.
think trying to front load that and hedge that is probably some of the best efforts our city can spend their time on.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. And from our perspective in working with cities as well, I think we think of it in kind of three buckets, right? There's the prevention, and then there's this group that's sort of in the middle, which is folks that are reintegrating into society, either from the justice system, from the streets, or from addiction recovery programs. Those folks, if there's even a single night where they end up having to sleep outside, you can lose them like that, right? Because it's really quick and easy to become subject to substance use for survival, or get involved in a crisis that then gets you back in jail or whatever, right? So that's not always the case, but if you can prevent homelessness through eviction prevention and through good policy and working with and engaging landlord communities, that's one strategy. Working it with those populations to grab them at their point of reentry so they don't go outside at all. That's a really important conversation and plan to have. And then, of course, there's 650,000 people already living unhoused across the United States of America. And I think it's actually higher now. We don't have the 2024 counts back yet, but they're already saying they're going to be even higher than last year. So we have to address the needs of that population as well and accept the fact that the trauma's already been done. And we have to address that too, right? So that's kind of a threefold process when you think about homelessness, right? And then a lot of people become homeless because of events, climate events, because of migrant events, whatever it might be. So really interesting and important part of the conversation.
Yeah, and I think there's some other interesting threads there too, right? We were talking about it kind of primarily in the context of today, right? In a kind of a pre-disaster situation. But when you mention disasters, I think that's one of the things that where community planning really comes into place, right? We
Mhm.
saw what happened in New Orleans after
Yeah,
Katrina, where
yeah,
the population effectively went to zero overnight, right, from a full evacuation of the city, and it took years for the city to get their population back, right? A
right.
lot of people were in places like Houston or other places in Texas. And guess what? When you start to put down roots somewhere else, you're probably not going back.
Yep,
And when we think about a city like San Francisco, a city where affordability is already at the paramount of kind of what everyone thinks about, people are having a hard time hanging on today. So
yeah,
in a disaster, if those folks are going out of the city, the chances of us getting them back as residents diminishes greatly. And it
right.
really led to kind of how we formed our housing strategy post disaster. And again, this was largely shaped by former Mayor Ed Lee, but also with some great work from Doug Allers and the folks at the Harvard Kennedy School. And what we did is we realized that, we want people to basically stay in their homes. If they
Mhm.
can't stay in their homes, we want them to stay in their neighborhood. If they
Yep,
can't stay in their neighborhood, we want them to stay in the city. And so I think that kind of three-tiered approach really gets us kick-started and kind of a leg up on the recovery. If you're thinking about, I may not be able to stay in my house because of whatever damage from whatever event. If I can stay in a community center that's within walking distance from my house, I'm much more connected than if I'm in Sacramento, several 100 miles away or something like that, at another facility. So I think keeping people local is instrumental. When you take these people out of the community, they're not connected anymore.
yeah,
And that also has its other disproportionate impacts on them
right.
as a person, right? If you're not connected within your community socially, health wise, there's a lot of cascading impacts that not being at home will do to you.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I totally agree. And for the city officials, it has a significant impact as well, because now you've lost your firefighters, your police force, your teachers, your hospitality workers, right? Everything that you need to maintain an economic basis for your community has now migrated away. So preparing for that not to happen is a really critical piece to sustainability. So, well, we have a ton of other really great questions here that I wish we had time to get to, but we are out of time, and I want to respect everyone's time. So we have here some resources for you to go and take a look at things. We are going to provide answers to all your questions. There's an awesome one in here, Patrick, about insurance that I really want to answer. So Patrick and I are going to put our heads together and answer all of your questions. We're going to provide a link to the recording of this webinar to everyone who registered, as well as a written description to the questions. So if we didn't get to your question, don't worry, we will get it to you. Thank you all for coming. Patrick, thank you so much for giving us your time. You are so wise and smart about these things, and I'm so grateful for your efforts and all that you've done across the country to help with housing. And we thank everyone for coming, and we'll see you next time. Have a good day.